Hi. So it's 2021 in the United States, and if it feels like we're going through a self-defeating cycle when we discuss racism, that's not altogether an incorrect viewpoint or analysis. Let's talk about why. This country, the United States, is a country that's founded on slavery, particularly chattel slavery. And the racism that resulted from that practice of that peculiar institution was used to justify it. The founders of this country, especially including Jefferson, all of them owned slaves. Even Benjamin Franklin owned slaves. And so, and to give you an idea of how they knew it was wrong, Thomas Jefferson has a famous quote. He says in one of his letters, "I tremble for my country when I think that God is just." And he was talking about this institution of slavery. And the only way that you can know that what you're doing is wrong and still continue it and still maintain that institution is if, obviously, you're making money on it, if it benefits you in some way, but also if you're able to use, I guess, a psychological justification for it. And that's what racism in this country that's where it really comes from. It comes from this idea that in order to maintain this peculiar institution that was practiced differently all over the world in non-Christian countries, in order to maintain that, it had to be functioning alongside racism. And that was the only way that someone like Jefferson could write those sentences and think the way he did and still sleep at night. Same thing with Benjamin Franklin and so on and so forth. Now, when we understand this sort of issue, what you really want to look at is the fundamental problem, which is segregation. And if all the United States has been doing is trying to fix racism rather than segregation, then of course it's going to fail. And so think about what affirmative action is. What is affirmative action? It's trying to fix artificially, whether in college admissions or in the workplace, it's trying to fix the issue of racism, but not in a way that resolves housing segregation, wealth gaps, and so on and so forth. And as a result, you're sort of putting the cart before the horse. And so by doing it that way, you necessarily defeat whatever aim you have, because you're trying to, by fiat, make something equal that is not equal and not ready to be equal. And when you do it that way, you create backlash. When things don't work, there's a backlash, and that leads to further division, especially if the programs just don't work, and especially if they're being handed down from up on high. And that's what's really happened in the United States on the issue of racism. We've been talking about racism. We should have been talking about segregation. And just to get an idea, if you think that you're more enlightened than the founders of this country, just think about whether or not you would want somebody who is poor, has only manual labor skills, can't read, doesn't have a high school education. Think about whether or not, it doesn't own property and does not have a bank account. Think about whether or not you want that person to live next to you. Again, there's no race involved. I haven't said anything about race, but that would be the equivalent of a newly freed slave. And so slaves were, of course, considered property. They were investments. And, by slave masters who bred slaves in order to maximize output from tobacco, sugar, and cotton fields. Now, when you look at it in this context, you can see why segregation continued, and you can see how racism assisted the entire enterprise. If you try to suddenly make a lot of poor people free, who don't necessarily have the same skill sets as everyone else, or even the average person in that country, you're going to have segregation in order to create some sort of ability to incrementally improve the situation. But that's not what's happening in the United States. Because all the programs have been focusing on fixing racism rather than segregation, what's really happened is all the programs, all the anti-racism programs, all they've done is further cement the institution of segregation based on race in this country, which over time has become segregation based on economic wealth. And there's a sense that we're continuing to focus on the superficial because we can't fix the fundamental. Why? Well, think about if we keep going into these cycles, think about who benefits from that. The status quo is maintained. As long as you're not fixing the problem that's giving rise to all these other problems like racism that then lead to social division, the status quo is maintained. The loans will be paid, financial relationships are paid, housing values are maintained because we're not doing anything fundamentally different. So you now have a situation in the United States where you're essentially in a very difficult position to the extent that you want to do a U-turn. Because you've spent all this time on the wrong problem. And the reason that you're in a cycle is because you keep spending time on the wrong problem because it's financially profitable to do it that way. Now, let's go back to the other example, by the way. The other example I just mentioned is, I keep saying the same thing. Nobody likes poor people. And nobody wants them to live next door. And some people might say, well, wait a second, they might confuse the argument and just replace it with race. Well, and some people might argue, well, you know what? I wouldn't have a problem with a Muhammad Ali, a child living next to me that would be the next Muhammad Ali. So I disagree with your contention. I'll explain to you why that is an admirable counter-argument, but it's wrong. Muhammad Ali was middle class. His family was middle class. That's why he was able to have his parents buy him an expensive bike. He didn't get some used bike. One of the problems is people who are elites now, because it's now hereditary almost, as is the case in many Catholic majority governments, because it's now hereditary. It's based on a system of nepotism. And progress becomes a system of insiders versus outsiders when you have a system that's not based on merit or genuine concern for integration. When you have that, which is what expelled all the Protestants, which is what caused the Protestant movement and the Protestant Reformation in Europe, which is what caused the founders of this country, none of whom were Catholic, to come over here. When you have that system in place, you have another problem in the sense that if no one at the top is really poor, or has ever been poor, they're probably not going to understand poor people. So if you're poor, you get a used bike. No one who's really poor gets a new bike. So Muhammad Ali got a new bike. That tells you he was middle class. And he was middle class because Kentucky, in particular, had a state case that made it difficult to discriminate on the basis of housing. And no, it's not a case that I studied in law schools. It's just a case that I found on my own. But it explains why there was a middle class in Louisville, Kentucky at the time. And it explains why it was probably easier for white officer Joe Martin to take Muhammad Ali under his wing, because you didn't have a significant gap in terms of language, in terms of just culture. And you can also see why Muhammad Ali was so distraught over losing the bike, not only because it was new, but also because he would probably have to take some kind of segregated public transportation. Remember, the South was all about separate but equal, in theory. And so you had a situation where, so suddenly Muhammad Ali loses his bike, and now he either can't get to school, has to walk to school, or has to use a system of public transportation that may not be accessible. A country or a city that has separate but equal is not going to link, it's not going to make it easier for people to get from one place to another to the extent that they can prevent it. Now, you look at that, so I think hopefully we've covered that argument. The other reason why it's hard for people here to understand the problem, which is why they keep focusing on something superficial rather than something fundamental, is because most people here haven't traveled. If you go to Northern Africa, you'll notice a lack of segregation. And one of the things that hits you as soon as you go into Northern Africa, whether it's Tunisia, Morocco, or so on, or Egypt, is just all these different colors. As an American, you're kind of used to seeing a very small number of colors. Hey, segregation, right? It makes sense. And then when you go to Northern Africa, you're hit by all these colors you just haven't seen before because there wasn't segregation. And that, of course, goes back to, just the fact that, all of Africa was at one point colonized or occupied or conquered by the Muslims. And the Muslims did not practice chattel slavery. They had a system where, in fact, you could not be Muslim and be a slave. And that's one of the reasons why being a Muslim is so difficult, because you have to, right now it's Ramadan, you have to fast from sunup to sundown, no water, no food. It's almost as if, it's very similar if you want to put it in some sort of context, some sort of modern context. It's very similar to a military style program that creates bonding based on merit and difficulty. And so because of that system, which does not exist, it exists on some level, say Lent, but not really. It's not a systemic process that creates bonding. And it's certainly not something that brings the community together 5 times a day. So you've got this system where you go to Africa, you're hit by all these different colors, and you start asking yourself, why didn't I see these colors anywhere else? And if you know your history as an American, you can probably figure it out. And even in the Western Hemisphere, most Africans are skinny, they're small, right? And especially on the east side. So one of the reasons that we don't have a lot of diversity here, though we think we do, is because the slaves from the West who were black, were for the most part from the west coast of Africa. So you don't have a nice mix of east, west, and so on and so forth. And so it's not a coincidence, you start to realize, that every country that has many black-colored people who speak Spanish, for the most part, you're dealing with people that are either overweight on average or bigger than average. So you go to Cuba, a country that was colonized by Catholic Spain. Got a lot of big Africans over there, people of African descent. You go to, and then even the Dominican Republic, which is a neighbor, a lot of big Africans over there. Then you go over to French-occupied Haiti, where they speak a different language, and you start to notice they're very skinny. So I don't want to paint this as a situation where all the Europeans were evil people that bred everybody in sight because they just couldn't think of a way to make money from tobacco, sugar, and cotton. Because the French, remember, they were essentially an anti-Catholic. Napoleon was on an anti-Catholic revolution. There's a famous quote I love saying it: "Mankind will never be free until the last king is hung by the entrails of the last Catholic priest." And there were a lot of problems, and Napoleon essentially put the Catholic Church under his jurisdiction. He forced the Catholic Church to essentially bend to the will of his centralized government. He was the one, all the appointments of bishops had to go through him or his office, and so on and so forth. But the French Revolution was really, again, this European religious process or conflict where the Catholic Church uses the law, uses its influence in order to create enclaves that back then were based on slavery, based on a globalized system of slavery. And then, after having gained political power, either discriminate against or expel non-Catholics. That was a process in Europe. That's why you had a Protestant Reformation. It didn't just begin with Martin Luther. It began with Jan Hus, and probably before that. You can look this up online. All you have to do is look up indulgences, corruption, Catholic Church, Europe. You see that you had a system in place where it was problematic for anyone that was not going along. You can also see why the Catholic Church was so authoritarian to the point where it essentially murdered or expelled or excommunicated any scientist that understood astronomy. Which, of course, means that you have a religion that's now based on storytelling more than logic. But it's been successful because, again, it's a very profitable way to govern. If you don't have to pay for labor and you have a philosophy and a system that has free labor in a way that justifies it based on racism, it's a very profitable system. And now, as a result, in the year 2021, we have a Catholic president. One of the largest landowners in this country, as well as the world, is the Catholic Church. None of these things are coincidences once you understand history. But again, the only way you understand it in context is if you travel and if you've been poor at some point in your life. Because the dynamics in human nature are almost always the same, simply because human beings are a relatively new species on the planet. We haven't really, despite visual differences, we haven't really sort of evolved very differently. And so when we talk about chattel slavery, which of course is what led to segregation in the United States, you also have to understand that foreign countries also suffered from a type of segregation, namely colonialism. So when the British Empire was going around and essentially building its influence all over the world, post 1611, well, that wouldn't be the British Empire. That would be when the Portuguese, the Catholics, took over the Straits of Malacca, either 1611 or 1511. I always get those dates mixed up. And that signaled the end of Islamic influence in Southeast Asia and, at that point, the Western Hemisphere. Because you had the loss of the Straits of Malacca led to a loss of global influence because it's such an important port. And we know it's an important port even today because we're still having issues over what's called the South China Sea, which is essentially the Straits of Malacca. The same problems that existed 400, 500 years ago continue today. That tells you that not much has changed. So we shouldn't try to pat ourselves on the back if we're trying to say that we've committed some sort of progress. Now, overall, when you had colonization, it was a little bit different, though. So let's say the British would go into Malaysia. They would bring in Chinese laborers. I'm guessing from Canton, I really don't know. And they would bring them in, and they would essentially set up a kind of an ethnic enclave that was run by, you could call them warlords, you could call them town elders, but essentially it was a hands-off policy. It was a policy of non-intervention. They would assign somebody in charge, somebody who could control the labor, and then they would have a policy of non-intervention. We won't go there, you don't come to our side of town. It's a strictly business relationship. You're here to make money, we're here to use your labor. We won't interfere in each other's businesses because we don't understand each other. We don't speak the same language for the most part, and we don't really want to get to know each other that much anyway, because at least one of us probably believes that in the inferiority of the other from a cultural perspective. So you put all these things together and you understand when you go into Malaysia that you're now dealing with an ethnic enclave in some places. But it's a different kind of an ethnic enclave. It's not a ghetto. If you go into, you can see how different this would be. Let's say you go into Hungary and there's the largest Jewish community in Europe was in Budapest. And of course, that's what made it easier for the Nazis and the Europeans to round up the Jews, because again, you have this essentially divide and govern policy, which is what made colonization successful. It was easy to govern people because you didn't have to be diplomatic, and you could have not just a separate but equal policy. But under colonization, it was never meant to be separate but equal. It was just meant to be separate and a non-interventionist governance model. But it's different because you are still allowing self-governance. So you're not in a position where, you're in a position where people within those towns that are ethnic enclaves will probably have a court system of some sort. I wouldn't call it a court system. It's a Western concept for the most part. What you're really dealing with is a system of dispute resolution. It was run by themselves. So you didn't have, for the most part, the same incentives of exploitation, the same sort of hard territory of cultural mismatches that would probably lead to miscommunication and possibly violence and so on and so forth. And so as a result, the Chinese in Malaysia did fairly well for themselves because they had a different history. They were used but not entirely exploited because they had self-governance. And they had it because the British or any other colonizer decided that was the easiest way to handle labor that they didn't want to do. So there's a difference. You don't really see the difference unless you travel. You can't understand history until you travel. And that's one of the reasons why the United States continues to sort of focus on these issues like racism that are true, that exist, but they focus on it in a way that is guaranteed not to fix the fundamental problem. Because in order to understand it, you have to teach people history. How are you going to teach your own people that the President of the United States is there because he's been boosted by a legacy of profit and tax evasion or tax exemptions that are the incremental progress of chattel slavery that was practiced in a way unlike other areas? How are you going to teach that and still maintain legitimacy? How are you going to say to your people, given the massive wealth gaps in this country, that it's based on meritocracy? You can see why, again, there are so many incentives to avoid the truth in this country. Now, running away from it is not going to fix it. So that's something that we have to sort of look at. Now, when you put all these things together, and you look at colonization, and you look at what was done to fix it, that's a more interesting question, because you look at what happened in Singapore. And the Singaporeans had racial riots. They called them race riots. But rather than try to go about fixing a problem of racism, Lee Kuan Yew, the founder of Singapore, went about fixing the problem of segregation. And so he, very similar to the United States, he had a policy where people would, for the most part, be encouraged to own a home. It would be subsidized, and so on and so forth. But with a twist. You would have a system in place where you could not have any ethnic enclaves. So you would lower the price of housing, you would subsidize it significantly. A policy that is continued today. If you want to get a mortgage in Singapore, you're looking at probably a 1.5 to a 2.5% interest rate. Maybe, it's a heavily subsidized situation. As long as you're staying in a government subsidized flat. Flat, of course, is British. It's a British term for apartment. Put all that together, and Lee Kuan Yew fixed the problem for the most part. No ethnic enclaves in this country. Singapore will be a country, he said. Not a Malay country, not a Chinese country. Everyone here is not a Tamil country. Everyone here is going to be Singaporean. That's easier to do when you have a small country, because you can't probably build your public transportation system in a way that, it's workable. You can't really have separate but equal the smaller you are. So you might as well have equal if you're small. So if you wonder why Singapore has been so successful, it's because its founder focused not on racism, despite having racial riots that eventually led to independence, Merdeka. He focused on fixing segregation. And today, because he focused on the right problem, Singapore is the most successful nation in the world. Perhaps Norway would be up there as well. But successful political class in the world as of today, from the 1950s onward, is Singapore. Not a coincidence. When you put together this colonization system that was really what was fueling globalization, the trade, you put all that together, it's not a coincidence that Singapore, by focusing on the right problem, succeeded. And had it not focused on the right problem, Lee Kuan Yew talks about Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. He says we didn't want to be like Ceylon, we wanted to be different. We didn't want to have racial problems. And so we focused on the most inclusive system possible, we knew we had to fix it in a way that prevented segregation. Now, you look at some other policies, and one of the criticisms of China is that you can't own land. People there cannot own land. Well, the reason that's the case, not because the Chinese government wants to prevent its own people from owning land, it's also because of a centralized development model. It's similar to buying a condo, here in the United States where you don't own the land. But in China's case, it's also a result of the legacy of colonization, because it doesn't want to have a system where it allows foreigners to buy up land and then eventually secede, which is what has happened in a lot of other countries that have allowed excessive and unregulated foreign direct investment in real estate. So China's model of real estate is designed to allow foreign investment, but not in a way that allows the potential for secession due to excessive foreign direct investment in real estate. And of course, China has a massive population. It has to build up, just like Hong Kong, just like Singapore. And the reason I mention China is because, again, it's colonization, right? Hong Kong, what is that? That's a port. What's Macau? It's a port. And you can't consider racism without understanding this need for manual labor as a result of a trade based on tangible items that had to be shipped worldwide within the context of people that just didn't want to work in the fields. They just didn't want to work 16 hours a day, picking anything or putting anything on a ship. Now, that's important in context. It helps establish further context because it shows you again that it's not just slavery, right? It's just this pursuit of the exploitation of labor in a way that's unsustainable. That's really the cause, right? It's really a pattern in human history that has led to massive inequality. So rather than trying to, we're also trying to fix inequality. The question is, how do we fix this issue of labor arbitrage, where it makes sense to ship some work overseas, especially quote-unquote low-end work, manual work, because you're able to hire cheaper labor relative to your currency. We still have that process in place, and until that process gets fixed, which is going to take a lot of time, there's an idea that we're probably not going to fix the problems that we have here today with respect to inequality. But I want to say that it's not unfixable, because colonization is not the same, but is similar, the dynamic, to what happened with slavery, in a sense of labor arbitrage or exploitation in some cases, but also this idea of foreign direct investment in a way that separated people from each other within the same country. So the pattern has been with colonization that a foreign power would invade based on superior military might and then force the leader of that country to go in debt in the occupying power's currency in exchange for what they would call protection and services. What was really happening is, you want to build a bridge, you'd rather let the host country pay for it in your currency. And then you come in and then you claim that you're giving jobs to people, which you are. But of course, you're doing it in a way that's exploitative and that allows your banking sector to dominate, because you're having your currency as the payment unit. Hey, United States, the United Kingdom, what's the number one industry? What's the strongest industry? You might say science and technology, but really it's finance. It's the banking system. Not a coincidence. But you look at it in context, and you start to see that the inequality that we have in this country is, in a sense, similar, because the pattern in history has been that what I just described, that foreign power coming in, creating occupation in the same way as a mafia would, right? The mafia, what do? They charge for protection. And what they're really saying is, you don't pay us, we'll break your house, we'll break your business, we'll destroy you. That is essentially the easiest, most straightforward way to think about colonization. But the reason that it succeeded, in a sense, is because it worked. That's also, by the way, why the mafia still exists, because it works. It fills in the gaps that a centralized government oftentimes ignores or just doesn't want to fix or doesn't have the capacity to fix. You can also see within that context why a foreign government would want to limit foreign ownership of land. Because to the extent that it discovers criminal activity too late, it can go about fixing the problem in a way that doesn't require, in an easier way, in terms of displacement. And, it's not also a coincidence, this overlap between the mafia, i.e. criminals, and colonizers. We look at Cuba, remember, there's an Al Pacino movie called Scarface. There's a scene with an immigration or customs agent that says that the Cubans are sending us all of their criminals to Miami. Not a coincidence, there's an overlap. It's also not a coincidence that the Miami banking system was the strongest for a while in the 1980s because it was essentially the depository for drugs and drug trade. Hey, remember that thing that we read about in school called the Opium Wars? Well, global trade didn't just include widgets. It included things that exist today, right? Drugs. And you can also see why the Chinese were so insistent on not having those drugs enter their country, because they didn't want to set up a criminal class in their country. You can also see why Hong Kong was so successful financially. What's Hong Kong? It's a financial center where, for the most part, criminals or people who are involved in the drug trade or global trade, same thing, are able to safely store their money. That's the reason for Hong Kong's success economically. And the weird thing about all this is that places that have criminal activity, that have more criminal activity, tend to be more diverse. That gives you a clue that the good guys, the strategy of practicing segregation is failing. It's one of the reasons why in the United States, we have, in many cases, sort of lionized the criminal, the bad guy, as opposed to the police officer. Now, you look around, we look at this policy of colonization. What really is happening there is that a capital city becomes more powerful because of its foreign investment, foreign funding, than everywhere else. It then allows a foreign power to install its own politicians, pass laws that favor globalized trade, in other words, other countries, over their own citizens, in a way that divides the country economically and culturally and legally. But it works because it's profitable for people, just like slavery was. The things we see today are simply incremental mutations of the things that happened 400 years ago. And nothing's been fixed and that's why we're having so many problems in places where these issues have not been fixed on a fundamental level. In places where they have been fixed, like Singapore, they're doing fine. They're doing wonderful, they're doing perfectly fine. Norway was the only country between Norway, Sweden, and Finland, was the only country that openly fought the Nazis. Hey, not a coincidence. Not a coincidence that Norway is now the most successful country in Europe, for the most part. I mean, I'm not going to talk about Luxembourg, and, I've never been to Luxembourg. I'm not going to talk about Monaco, right? We're talking about relatively, sizable countries, whether based on population or land. Not a coincidence. When you do things the right way, when you identify the problems the right way, that you don't have all these other accompanying issues, that you have to fix that puts you in a self-defeating cycle. And the reason that colonization has been less problematic than racism is, again, because the colonization did separate the capital city from the rest of the population, but it did so in a way that allowed, once the colonizers left, it did so in a way that allowed the people who came in, whether through revolution or otherwise, to try to amend the problems that were created. Although, of course, you still have debt, which is one of the reasons why a lot of the colonizers left. They just thought it would be a lot easier not occupying the place as long as they pay us back our loans. But you can see how it's similar but not the same. And the question for the United States right now is, if you have an economy that's based on housing inflation, that in turn is based on segregation, how do you fix it? Here's the bad news. You probably can't fix segregation in this country anytime soon. The country is founded on it. But here's the good news. What you can do is try to create, I hate to say it, ethnic enclaves. You look at what's the most successful Muslim city in America. It's in a segregated enclave of Dearborn, Michigan, outside of Detroit, where you have some diversity, right? You've got Christians, you've got Muslim Arabs, so on and so forth. But it's essentially a segregated place, another ethnic enclave. But what you can do, it wouldn't be such a bad thing, you could say to yourself, if in a big country, you had a lot of different Dearborn, Michigans, but that had their own flavor. And in order to do that, you're probably going to have to overinvest in segregated areas that were redlined before. You're probably going to have to overinvest, which that's going to create the same problems that we have in other places where housing values might become divorced from reality, might become unsustainable. You're going to have inequality just like you have within quote-unquote successful cities in the United States. Excuse me. But I don't necessarily see another way of fixing it. And I just don't know, for all my quote-unquote knowledge, which is not really knowledge. I don't want to say I just make observations. I was thinking the other day that if you ever get frustrated in terms of trying to understand all these different issues, just remember that it's actually not that hard. It's not going to be that difficult in the future, because travel recently became affordable, and it's going to become even more affordable as technology changes and improves. But so it's not just, I may be one of the few people who is able to give you context now, but in the future there will be millions of people just like me with my ability to put things in context. What they might not have, and the reason I'm doing this video, is the ability to put things in context in an environment where history is either manipulated or in a way where, if everyone lives in a suburb, they're not going to be able to make the connections I've made, because you can't lie. Geography and infrastructures don't lie. They can't lie. And if you go, like I said, you go to Northern Africa, or in Egypt, you've got these beautiful buildings that were designed and built by the French. They were beautiful. And then you go, but you can see they probably should be condemned at this point. They haven't been upgraded. And you can see what happened, right? The colonizers had to leave. But hey, guess what the currency of Egypt is? It's called the pound. It's British, right? The British pound. So I suppose one day, right, when the Egyptians have a different named currency, when that building is condemned, people will not be able to make the connections that I've made. That's why I'm doing this. But at the same time, I don't want anyone to feel pessimistic, because I'm not smarter than anybody else. I can lay brick. I can't build a house. You got guys over there that I just saw that looks like they're either building a house or fixing some concrete. I can't do that. I can't operate heavy machinery. I can't operate a Deere tractor or a Caterpillar. All I can do is observe. But even in the abstract, remember, I can't write a page like Sadie Smith. I can't really write fiction. I can't write a single page equivalent to Zadie Smith. And that's what keeps me humble. Because everything I do is nonfiction, which means that I'm able to have context, not necessarily because I'm unique in some way, although I have to tell you, right, obviously, like, the ability to be poor and then jump into the upper middle class, that gives you insight that you can't gain, but that's not something I did, right? I mean, so you see how you should be a bit more optimistic in the sense that these problems probably are fixable. And if you're in a country like the United States is playing catch up, you know, eventually the United States will probably get there. Eventually, not in my lifetime, but eventually. But I will never in my lifetime be able to write a single page of fiction like Zadie Smith or Junot Diaz. That's what keeps me humble. And even my poetry is, for the most part, nonfiction. All I do is observe. So if you're somebody who's trying to understand the world around you, I would actually give you Junot Diaz's advice. He had a Google talk. And he said, you know, just get out there. Instead of sitting down and writing, you have to have a trove of experiences that allows you to write well. You can't write well unless you have experiences. Well, how do you get experiences? You just travel, you walk around, and you observe. That's it. Anybody can do that. That's why I'm optimistic in a sense. Because anybody with enough time can do what I've done. What I've done is change history and the way history is going to be taught in the English language. Assuming we live in a country where people are honest, people actually want to learn history. That's what I've done. I've turned history on its head. But it's something that somebody else would have done anyway. It's just that I happen to be in this position at this time through no merit of my own. And there's going to be a million more people just like me. And unfortunately, I won't be around to see all of them. But I wish all of you good luck.